This presentation is on the Industrial Revolution, subtitled Overcoming the Biological Old Regime, which you will understand, I hope, in a couple minutes. As late as 1750, all of the world's people gathered what they needed for life, from what Robert B. Marx has called the biological old regime. That is to say, they got their food, shelter, clothing, and the energy they needed to do work, to cook, and to keep themselves warm from the land, agriculture. Their energy came from the earth and the sun. This is true also of mining, which, though not agriculture, is the uncovering of energy that has come from natural processes involving the land and the energy from the sun, as well as atmosphere. People took care of getting this stuff using muscle power, that is, the power from their own and animals' muscles, which needs to be replaced by items from the biosphere, like food that you've grown, or consuming animals who have consumed plants that you've grown. Also, they used animal muscle power, wind power, and water power. These are all elements of the biological old regime. Iron and steel making in the biological old regime relied upon charcoal, which is made from wood, and the muscle energy of humans and animals to build the fire, to move the bellows, and to shape the product. So even the making of what we would consider industrial products today was done using biological means. So the biological old regime set limits on the size of the human population and on the productivity of the economy. This video will show you a little bit about how the biological old regime worked in the case of an American frontier house. This is from a PBS video about contemporary Americans who decided to try and live out the lifestyle of frontier people. The Industrial Revolution can be defined as the replacement of the biological old regime with the ability to do work using machines and non-muscle powered energy sources. It began in England and was accompanied by what might best be called the capitalist revolution. These two key changes helped England, then Europe, break the limits of the biological old regime, increasing productivity and thus increasing the human population by making possible more of everything: more food, more housing, more energy, more work. So the question is, why did England industrialize first? We know that England was the first place in the world to industrialize. On the face of it, England seems, though, hardly the most likely place. Most observers of the world in the 18th century would have guessed that India or China would be the first to industrialize. And in fact, if you look here at the mid-1700s, if we were to draw a line straight up from that, close to straight up, you can see that India from 1700 until this period is near the top, and then China is near the top. Western Europe on the beginning of its ascent right here. So these two would have seemed more likely to industrialize than Europe. Chinese technology was more advanced than that of Europe. The Chinese and Indian populations were so large that if any society were likely to need to exceed the limits of the biological old regime, it would have seemed to be one or both of these two. In the 1750s, Indian textiles, particularly calico, was the fashion rage in England. The problem was that so much Indian cotton calico was entering England that domestic cloth producers who mostly worked with wool were unable to compete in the market. This was for a number of reasons. First, English labor was more expensive than Indian labor. This was not because Indian workers were cheaper, but because purchasing power was different in India. Indian workers' prices were lower than those in England, largely because they had land and raw materials that were less expensive and food that was less expensive. Food production levels were higher, and so it was less expensive. For these and other reasons, the income differential meant that Indian cotton, though it was not sold cheaply in the Indian economy, was less expensive to import into England than English wool cloth was to make. It was also more comfortable and was well made. India's competitive advantage in nearly all world markets was because of the size of its textile manufacturers and the size of its domestic market. Indian producers who produced by hand were able to sell for a price that was good within their own economy and inexpensive nearly everywhere else. India also benefited from the large amount of trade in other items that it had been engaging in for centuries, making transportation of cloth from India less expensive than it might have been anywhere else. Indian textiles were of high quality and plentiful enough for mass market sales, and the Indian agricultural system was so productive that the cost of living was quite low compared to that in England, for example, and so Indian laborers didn't require as much income in order to live well. English textile manufacturers knew that their key problem was the relative cost of labor. To fix this problem, they pursued three strategies. They encouraged the English government to block or set tariffs on the import of textiles from India. Raw cotton, which they imported to make textiles in England, was not regulated. They acquired colonies in India, eventually the whole of India, in order to control its textile and tea industries. And they attempted to find ways to increase the productivity of textile workers. The two most successful ways to increase worker productivity were to create a division of labor to increase the speed of labor and to build machines that allowed textile workers to make more in the same amount of time. We've already had an introduction to mercantilism, but let's look at it in a bit more detail and understand how it fits into the puzzle of the Industrial Revolution. Mercantilism was a practice rather than an economic theory. It was designed to provide wealth to the state in terms of actual gold and silver in its treasury, which was a room, or series of rooms, where precious metals were kept. The goal of this accumulation was simply to increase the power of the state. That meant more ships, more guns, and more soldiers. The state was the purpose of the economy, and all economic activity within the state was regulated to make certain that large portions of it flowed into the state treasury. This meant that the state reserved the right to license monopolies, so that companies like the English East India Company, which was owned in part by the British government, in part by members of the British Parliament, and in part by the Bank of England, had the sole right to trade in goods from India and Asia. This allowed the East India Company to buy at low prices and to set retail and wholesale prices within the British Empire at levels that were most profitable for the company. Competition was not allowed. This also meant that the high profits gave high taxes to the British government, and since the government was part owner of the company, it reaped profits from that actual business as well. In order to enforce this system, the British and the French, as well as other colonial states in Europe, used what were called Navigation Acts, laws that governed who could trade with the colonies and whom in the colonies could do business with what ways with whom in the mother countries. Colonial exports were only for Great Britain. Colonies could not sell to any other state or colony of any other state. They also could not buy anything from any other state or even, often, from each other. All goods had to be sent to England for manufacture and packaging, and then re-exported to the colonies. One example of this is rum and molasses. Molasses, the basis of rum manufacture, is one byproduct of the process of sugar milling. Islands in the Caribbean, which were most profitable colonies of Great Britain, were required to export their molasses to Great Britain for manufacture as rum. They were also legally allowed to manufacture small quantities of rum at home, but the North American colonies of Great Britain were not allowed to buy molasses or rum from the Caribbean. Instead, they had to import the finished products from Great Britain, which was much further away, making prices much higher. Since Great Britain charged export and import taxes on all molasses and rum, the prices increased due to that as well. So it would have been much cheaper for the colonies to import from the islands to the south, but that was just the point. The higher cost meant more profit for British companies and also for the British government. One effect of these Navigation Acts was that they encouraged smuggling, though this was not as common as we would think. Only about 1% of goods were smuggled in colonial America. I hope you can see that this is very different from the free market trade system that we try to use today. In 1793, American Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. American cotton was a different variety from that grown in India and very hard to remove seeds from. However, American cotton growers employed slaves, which made labor even less expensive than that of India. Still, until the cotton gin, the amount of labor required to de-seed the cotton kept American cotton more expensive than Indian cotton on average. The cotton gin, though, made removing the seeds much more efficient. It could do the work of 500 slaves in 1 hour. This made American cotton cheap and the cotton thus became useful to British textile manufacturers, who purchased it in large quantities. With the inexpensive cotton, the British manufacturers were able occasionally, when bad harvests or high transportation costs affected the Indian market, to provide substitutes for Indian cotton to Africa and Europe. In 1764, James Hargreaves, an English mechanic, invented the spinning jenny. This was just a new take on the spinning wheel concept. By creating a hand-turned flywheel that was attached to multiple spindles, Hargreaves' spinning jenny allowed one person to do the work of many people working with a single spindle spinning wheels. And this picture on the right here is a picture of a woman using a spinning jenny. And the key to understanding it is you can see she's turning this handle right here, and that handle then turns multiple spindles which twist and spin the thread in the process. And you can see that there are multiple spindles across the back line here, right down into here, and these are also finished spindles here. So one person can do the work of more than 20 people with the spinning jenny. This led to increased production and decreased the cotton wool. Hargreaves was not alone, though. In 1767, Richard Arkwright patented a technology known as the water frame, which used a concept similar to that of the spinning jenny, but attached to a water wheel, giving it the ability to turn even more spindles and thus increasing productivity even further. This is a photograph of an artist's rendering of an early water frame, and you can see several spindles down here. Ultimately, Arkwright's water frames could take up entire buildings that were set near the river, and hundreds, even thousands of spindles being spun at the same time. So these machines were controversial. On the one hand, from the point of view of manufacturers, they increased productivity so much that the cost dropped steeply. This allowed English cotton textiles to compete with Indian cotton anywhere in the world market. From the point of view of laborers, for whom the cost of food remained high, the need for labor decreased, as did wages, in part because of those laborers who were required no longer needed any special skills. As wages and employment declined, simultaneously, English textile workers who had been proprietors of their own businesses became wage laborers working for factory owners like Arkwright, and lost tremendous amounts of economic power in England. These were the twin effects of the Industrial Revolution nearly everywhere it occurred. So, the Industrial Revolution was contingent on market developments and the willingness of the English government to protect its market from Indian imports, as well as its willingness to support business through colonization, import protection, control of labor protest, and mercantilist self-interest. Scottish philosopher Adam Smith recognized the vitality of the North American colonies, soon to be a new nation, of the British Empire. Smith concerned himself with the question of what led the colonies to produce wealth out of the wilderness, and he came up with the notion that their distance from the British government, and so relative freedom from regulation, allowed individuals to prosper. Smith came to believe that the success of a national economy was directly related to the success of individual businesses. Smith's theory, which today we call capitalism, was focused on theoretical construct called the market, where people bought and sold goods and services. The market, he said, did not require government regulation beyond a minimum degree because competition led businesses to find ways to be efficient in order to maximize profits while providing quality so as not to lose customers. This is very different from mercantilist ideas. If government allowed the market to operate in this freely competitive way, Smith believed that would lead to an economy with large numbers of increasingly wealthy businesses, which could then be taxed minimally by the government, but the economy of scale would provide overall government revenue much greater than the monopolies of the mercantilist system. His book, called An Inquiry into the Wealth and Poverty of Nations, was published in 1776 and became the basis of what we call capitalism today. This set of ideas had impact far beyond the narrow focus on the market that Smith initially focused upon. It resonated with other Enlightenment ideas, such as those of John Locke regarding limited government power and the social contract, and with the events occurring in the textile trade as British manufacturing began to be globally competitive because of reduced prices and mass manufacturing techniques. When this happened, the British government quickly became an advocate of free trade everywhere, and the government and manufacturers justified this change in terms of Smith's theory of capitalism. Britain abandoned its own protectionist policies, no longer needing them to compete, and required its colonies and trade partners to trade freely as well. Without the ability to protect their economies from less expensive British goods, the manufacturing and transportation industries in less advanced economies quickly began to collapse. Indian cotton cloth makers, for example, nearly disappeared as the only cotton product that India could successfully export was raw cotton. The Navigation Acts in the mercantilist system were no longer necessary to support the economic improvement of the British state. And I also want to make sure that we debunk the scientific myth. This is a picture of the Wedgwood factory created by Josiah Wedgwood in 1766 and maker of still famous pottery. The key myth that is perpetuated by the rise of the West narrative when it comes to the Industrial Revolution is that it was contingent upon the scientific revolution of the 17th century. This ignores two key issues. First, although science as it is currently understood in the West, predicated on the scientific method as the path to discovery and on the free communication of experimental results, most of the major empires in the world, and especially China and the Ottoman Empire, had effective and productive scientists in large numbers who made discoveries about the world that were globally important. Alhazen discovered the way that humans see and the basics of optics in the 11th century in the Fatimid Caliphate, which was eventually absorbed by the Ottoman Empire. Alhazen, an Indian mathematician and astronomer, Madhave of Sangamagrama, discovered mathematical ideas that eventually became part of calculus. Chinese water clocks graced major cities, and the Chinese emperor had astronomical observatories well before Europe did. The second problem with the myth of the scientific revolution as antecedent to the Industrial Revolution in England is that all of the major inventions, the power loom, spinning jenny, water loom, and steam engine among others, were, like the inventions of the Wedgwood factory above, created by mechanics and backyard tinkerers. There's no evidence that science was involved in the making of these new machines, or scientists. Finally, the Industrial Revolution was also the result of accident. The biggest of those accidents was the fact that coal was easy to find in England. This easy availability of coal created a kind of endless cycle of industrial growth. As England had used most of its forest land for fuel or fires, the limits of wood availability, an environmental limit of the biological old regime, required people to find new ways of heating their homes. The easy availability of coal made it cheap. Moreover, coal was so prevalent that religious dissenters, these were English Protestants who were legally not allowed to own land or work in cities, found easy work picking up coal from agricultural land for free because landowners wanted the coal cleared away. The dissenters sold the coal and made a profit. As the need for coal grew, however, the coal on the ground was soon used up and mining had to begin. This was more costly and required pumps to remove water from the coal pits. The pumps that were developed required steam engines to pump water efficiently, and those engines required coal. So to get coal, the machines needed coal. If we put all of these events together in a causative framework, we can begin to see the multiple causes of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, it had multiple and far-reaching effects as well, which we are still encountering today. This is the very definition of conjuncture, when several major historical antecedents come together to create a major change in the way the world works that has effects across many areas of human activity and over long periods of time. The Industrial Revolution pulled together the European need to be part of a global trading system, the discovery and colonization of the Americas, the development of European technology, and changes in economic theory and practice based on the needs of European states who were fighting each other in a desperate, evenly matched set of wars while they tried and failed to create a single Europe-wide empire. The effects were numerous and long-lasting. Though it would take another 200 years, by the mid-19th century, Europe was the wealthiest part of a world trade system that was now centered on Europe's Atlantic coast. European systems of manufacture provided the military and economic power to conquer whole continents in search of raw materials for the new manufacturing systems, and labor to produce those raw materials, as well as customers to buy European manufactured goods. The European method of organizing into small, centralized states evolved into the nation-state system by which we organize our societies today. European extension of power into colonies tended to spread ideas of capitalism and industrialism that led to changes in the way that societies conducted social and economic and ultimately political affairs across the world, and made these European ideas look to many societies which were colonized or in danger of colonization like the solution to their desire to be rid of European control. Modernization came in the 19th century to look like Westernization, and the West claimed that its mission to colonize was justified because Western ideas were the solution to all problems, regardless of history, culture, religion, geography, or politics in the rest of the world as well.